Thank you once again for joining us, everyone. My name is William Ackerman. I'm the philanthropy coordinator for iNewsSource. Welcome to the second edition of our quarterly Dig This series. And thank you so much for joining us and being a supporter of iNewsSource if you are a supporter. If you're a guest of a supporter joining us today, you are encouraged to support our journalism by going to inewssource.org and donating on our website, or you can visit donate.inewssource.org. So today's Dig This webinar will be on immigration and how it's impacting San Diego. We'll be detailing all the great reporting that we've been doing this year at the border and on immigration. And it's going to be a really engaging webinar, and you're in for a real treat today with Sophia and Jamie telling us about our reporting. And our mission here at iNewsSource as a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom is dedicated to improving lives in the San Diego region and beyond through impactful, data-based, investigative, and accountability journalism. Our vision is one where betrayals of the public trust are revealed and rectified, wrongdoing is deterred, and inequalities are illuminated thanks to iNewsSource's deep, dogged, fact-based reporting. And I'm just going to briefly go over the agenda for today. So we're going to have a kickoff and introduction of everything that's going on right now, which I'm currently doing. We're just going to kind of transition into the main portion of things once we conclude with that. There'll be a background and introduction of our immigration reporting lasting for about half an hour. And then if there are questions that you would like to pose, we're going to have a very brief pause in the middle of that just to address any pressing questions, just one or two questions, very brief. Before we proceed into the rest of the presentation. We do encourage you to use the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. And that is located, if you navigate to your Zoom toolbar, there's like three little white dots on the right that you can click. And in the drop-down menu, there is the Q&A feature that you can use to post questions. We ask this because it's very helpful for us in organizing responses and things like that. And after another main portion of our webinar lasting until about 6:50, we will then proceed into the main Q&A portion of things where we will field any remaining questions. Just to introduce our reporters today, Sophia joined us in August 2021 and covers the San Diego-Tijuana region and the people who live, work, and pass through the area. Her reporting experience has come full circle. She grew up in San Diego working for a local news weekly and now reports on the border for her hometown. Sophia is a UC Santa Barbara graduate and a member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Jamie manages the newsroom and drives our editorial strategy as the managing editor. She also joined us in 2021, and she joined us from her home state of South Carolina, where she led the politics and state government team at the state newspaper in Columbia. Before that, she was an investigative and political reporter, covering first in the South presidential primaries and state elections, and producing award-winning enterprise and investigative reporting on many state issues, including public corruption, child welfare, education, abortion, gun rights, and more. And so without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Jamie and Sophia.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. And thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening. I want to echo that we can't do this work without your support. And it's always really special to see so many people show up and want to hear about it. So I'm especially excited to share this time with you and Sophia this evening. She's done just a tremendous job covering the border and immigration for us. Our approach to any beat is to find stories on important issues that other news outlets aren't covering, or to find new important angles to the big stories of the day. And we at iNewsSource are, of course, laser focused on accountability reporting. And to that end, Sophia has produced a range of stories, many of them with impact, which is what we strive for most. She's published investigations on Border Patrol's chase policies and agent conduct. She's written extensively about deaths along the US-Mexico border, and her work has raised questions about the effectiveness of how Border Patrol and local agencies respond to medical emergencies, especially after the wall was raised to 30 feet. She's also covered how local public policies intersect with immigration at vaccine clinics and in shelters and on the streets of San Diego. And today she'll talk a little bit about what's happening at the border and dive into her work and what she's learned while covering immigration here. So with that, Sophia, let's get started. We've heard so much about immigration in the news lately. So start by getting us up to speed on this moment at the southern border. What's happening right now?
Sure thing. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. I'm really excited to talk with all of you. But yes, what's happening at the border right now? We can start by talking about the numbers, right? The number of migrant arrivals that we're seeing at the US-Mexico border. So last month, Border Patrol recorded 56,000 encounters at the US-Mexico border, and this number of encounters refers just to people who agents apprehend at the border who are suspected of crossing into the US outside legal ports of entry. So this is the number of folks crossing into the US illegally last month. Now, 56,000 is a pretty low number comparatively, right? We're coming off of a year of record migration to the US in 2023. For comparison, in December 2023, we had 250,000 encounters at the US-Mexico border, so about 5 times what we saw in July. So it's a big change. And what's driving this? Why are we seeing such lower numbers of people crossing in this way? Well, experts say there are a few reasons. One of them is Biden's recent border order, which went into effect in June. This is a bit complicated and sort of involves some triggers having to do with how many people are entering at certain times. But what you need to know now is that right now it's severely limiting asylum access at the border. US law says that any non-citizen in the US, regardless of how a person enters the US, has the right to claim asylum. And this, of course, doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be granted asylum. But this order, Biden's border order, makes it so that people who cross into the US illegally, at least right now, can be immediately deported to Mexico or their home countries without having their asylum claims assessed by immigration authorities. And immigration advocates say that this kind of restriction is illegal and it puts migrants in danger. But on the opposite side, immigration critics say that this policy really isn't doing enough to limit the number of people entering the country. But some other factors that are contributing to the lower migrant arrivals we're seeing right now. Another one is increased immigration enforcement within Mexico. So Mexican immigration authorities have also increased enforcement of their own borders, their northern border with the US and their southern border, and they're making it more difficult for migrants who are on the way to the US via Mexico to get to the northern border, right? So if you're a migrant traveling from South America or Central America to the US, suddenly that's gotten a lot harder. I've personally talked with many migrants who have eventually reached the US, but along their months-long journey, they were sent back once or even twice by Mexican immigration authorities, sent back to the southern border of Mexico.
Thanks so much, Sophia. Let's step back for a minute and talk about 2023 because it was such a big year. You say it's a record year for unauthorized migration. Tell us more about why that was. And in your reporting, what did you see unfold here in San Diego or in San Diego County at the time?
Sure. Yeah. And 2023 was a record year for migration flat out, both unauthorized crossings and crossings through legal ports of entry. But to understand why why we saw so many crossings in 2023, we really have to go back to the pandemic, back to Title 42. And for those of you who don't remember, this was the pandemic era health policy that Trump enacted that essentially shut down asylum access at the border. It meant that most asylum seekers crossing into the US during this time were being immediately expelled from the country without getting a chance to seek protection in the US, again, as is normally possible under US asylum law. And this policy, Title 42, had an effect on communities south of the border as well, as people were on their way to the US from all over the border, from South and Central America, crossing through Mexico. They were essentially forced to wait in northern Mexican border cities, including Tijuana, right, for the chance to enter the US, because many of them knew that one day Title 42 would be rolled back. So really, this had the effect of sort of swelling shelters in Tijuana with more migrants who were now waiting longer, and that certainly strained resources. But getting back to the record migration, right? When Biden finally rolled back Title 42 in May 2023, there was an increase in border crossings, in part because of this pent-up demand while asylum was shut down essentially during Title 42. And also during this time, like world migration increased generally. More and more people are on the move across the globe due to a lot of reasons, but political reasons, political persecution or climate change. So that also went up too. But what did this look like in San Diego? Well, in May 2023, after the order was rolled back, we saw hundreds of people crossing into the US via gaps in the border wall in San Diego. Places like Jacumba and Boulevard, which are communities in Southeast San Diego County. And so sometimes hundreds of people were crossing a day in these areas. And these were folks that wanted to be documented. They wanted to be, they were surrendering themselves to immigration authorities. They wanted to be documented. They weren't running away or evading Border Patrol. They, were coming here because they wanted to pursue asylum claims or protection or economic or other opportunities in the US. But one of the problems was that there were so many people crossing at once that Border Patrol said they didn't have enough agents. They didn't have the capacity to process people quickly. So what happened is these migrants, many of them families with young children, elderly or medically vulnerable people, ended up waiting hours or days at a time, essentially in the open desert with very little food, water, shelter. The day that Title 42 was rolled back, we were out in Jacumba as people were experiencing this and building shelter from sticks and bushes and burning their own belongings to stay warm. We actually did a project in January where a team of 4 reporters spent 48 hours straight in the desert in Southeast San Diego County, observing and documenting the experiences of people as they crossed into the US, and then as they waited to be documented by Border Patrol. We saw extreme temperature swings and wind and rain and medical emergencies. So today, these encampments are really not present in these areas anymore. Crossings are so low that we don't see people waiting so long to be processed by Border Patrol. But those encampments, right, where dozens to hundreds of people were waiting at a time, was a consistent trend from May 2023 through December.
Thanks, Sophia. So fast forward again to right now. You said that numbers are low now. Will they stay that way? What are experts saying we should expect?
Yeah, so it's helpful to keep in mind that migration trends and migrant arrivals are constantly changing. They're always fluctuating. And experts say that this drop in migrant crossings won't last. The factors that are contributing to these lower numbers, some say, are just really stopgaps in this system, and they're not addressing the real reasons that are pushing people to leave their home countries in the first place. Immigration advocates are still hugely concerned with the current border policy under Biden. They say it's illegal, and it continues to put people in vulnerable situations as they're waiting across the border. You know, even though Title 42 is rolled back, we still see many migrants waiting in northern Mexican border cities for their chance to enter the US. Because right now, the only way to legally enter the US to pursue asylum is to have a CBP-1 appointment. There are some exceptions to this, but basically CBP-1 is this government app that now asylum seekers must use in order to make an appointment to go to a port of entry and make their asylum claim or seek some other type of protection in the US. And this is a big waiting game. I mean, people don't know when they're going to get their appointments. They might find out a few days to 2 weeks before, but many migrants end up waiting months in Tijuana for the moment that their appointment is going to come. And there's lots of other issues with this app that we could get into, but I think the question now is what's happening to people who have been on their way to the US when Biden's border policy went into effect, right? We know that people sometimes make months-long journeys to get here. So what's happening with the people that have been on their way to the US when this order was put in place? Has this policy changed their calculus about coming to the US? At least in my reporting, I've taken this moment to think about and to focus on what's been happening with migrants after they've entered the US, right? We just finished this record year in migration, and we're seeing, you know, as migrants are settling into the communities across the US, the challenges that they're facing, including in San Diego, right? We recently did some reporting on migrants who ended up homeless in San Diego County after crossing the border months ago, or even more than a year ago. And I think San Diego has had a reputation for a long time of being a, you know, transit city, like a place where migrants are really just passing through, right? Because we have this big port of entry, the busiest land port of entry, probably in the world. And so it's had this reputation of being a place where people pass through on their way to other communities in the US, like New York. But anecdotally, as I've been talking to people, I've been meeting a lot more migrants who want to make San Diego their home, either after moving from other US cities like Chicago or Boston, New York. And so I think that's also something that local leaders haven't really addressed at this moment, is that, you know, maybe that shift from San Diego being more of a transit place to somewhere that people are choosing to make their home. Sorry, I had some photos that I wanted to share just in case folks are interested. If you want to go to the next view, the one after this one. Right, so this is, I briefly mentioned the, right, in 2023, record crossings, people coming into San Diego County through the desert. This is a photo from, I believe, the first day that Title 42 was rolled back near Jacumba. We saw a lot of people who were sort of confused and stunned, and this is the area where many people ended up waiting for hours or days at a time. I think I have one more picture here, Will, if you want to go to the next one. Yeah. This is also on the date Title 42 was turned back. It was really hot that day in the desert. So I think, you know, that people were struggling to wait in the heat for as many hours as they did.
Great. And I know you have more, and we'll get to those shortly. So we'll get back into the questions then. And, you know, I tell Sophia this all the time. She's deep in the weeds of reporting on the border. And I tell her all the time, hey, your job is really interesting. And not everybody gets to be a border and immigration beat reporter. Not every reporter comes anywhere close to this job. And as we've discussed, it's not easy. It's definitely not the same thing as covering a public meeting in the city of San Diego. So I want to take a minute to ask you, Sophia, to walk us through what's your job like? What are the biggest challenges you face? And also, what do you find most rewarding?
Sure. Well, every day is different. Some days I'm in Tijuana, visiting migrant shelters across the city, talking with migrants about the conditions that drove them to leave their home countries, and talking with shelter directors about trends they're noticing as, how US policies are changing, who are showing up to their shelters. Other times I'm driving along the border in these areas like Kakumba or Dulzura or Boulevard, trying to get a sense of where people are crossing and how many and how that has changed over time. The other days I'm calling researchers, I'm talking to experts and policymakers, or I'm in immigration court, or I'm in people's homes, or these like other intimate part of their lives, trying to understand the story, whatever story that we're working on. Challenges, there are many, of course. I think language is an obvious one. I speak Spanish. That's something I've had to do a lot for this job, but really the makeup of people that have entered the US through San Diego has changed a lot. And part of that has meant that, people from all over the world are now crossing into the US through San Diego. So people from Haiti who speak Haitian Creole, or people from China or Brazil. So managing all those languages, trying to get the story, via Google Translate or whatever it takes, is another challenge. The probably one that comes up most often is just dealing with like massive federal agencies that are not transparent and that are really difficult to hold accountable. Customs and Border Protection and Border Patrol is who I'm talking about, and they're really hard to hold accountable. Like they're the largest law enforcement agency in the country, and I think that's part of what makes them feel so like accountable to no one, is that they're really accountable to everyone. I wrote a story about a US teen who died in a car crash with Border Patrol a few years ago, 2 years ago now, I believe. And to this day, Border Patrol has still refused to say why they tried to pull him over in the first place. We filed so many public records requests. We filed Freedom of Information Act requests to Border Patrol, but also requests to El Cajon Police, to California Highway Patrol, to the medical examiner's office, trying to piece together the story and what happened. And in the end, we learned from CHP that the only reason Border Patrol stated on record for starting the chase with this kid is that he didn't yield when they tried to pull him over. But of course, that doesn't answer why they tried to pull him over in the first place. All that's just to say it's really hard to nail down these types of answers to important questions that Border Patrol should be answering. Another more recent example, I wrote a story about a Border Patrol agent who allegedly showed sexually explicit photos of himself to civilians on the job twice. And we, of course, wanted to get his personnel records and try to see if something like this had happened before, if he had ever been accused of misconduct or inappropriate behavior on the job. And we couldn't get that because Border Patrol said that we would need the agent's permission to get his personnel record. So, sometimes ridiculous examples of how difficult it is to get information from these agencies. Other challenges, just understanding immigration policy, which is constantly changing. Dealing with people who have been through a lot of trauma, like a lot of the migrants we work with have had traumatic journeys to the US or are coming from traumatic conditions in their home countries. So that requires some delicacy. And as far as rewarding moments, I think anytime that we're able to have impact in reporting that we do is really rewarding. Like early on, I wrote a story about how San Diego County's vaccine policy was making it really hard for undocumented residents to get COVID vaccines. This was earlier on in the pandemic. And after we wrote that story, the county changed their policy to make it easier for these people to get vaccines. More recently, with some of my reporting on migrants who have ended up homeless in San Diego, I wrote about a woman who was struggling to find daycare for her, I think he was 2 years old, her 2-year-old son who has autism. And it was making it really challenging for her to get a job. So after he wrote that story, someone reached out to us who, offered services from an agency that he directs. So they were able to connect with this woman and her son and get her some help. So anytime that happens, right, we feel really, really satisfied.
Great. Thank you so much, Sophia. So you've talked about some of the people that you've met, and I know from working with you that you've talked to hundreds, probably hundreds of migrants in the short time that you've been covering this beat, which is a couple years. What do they tell you about their journeys and what challenges they face? What kinds of remarkable stories are you hearing in the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Okay, Will, if you could fast forward to a few photos. Yes. Okay. So this is a photo, sorry, no context yet, but this is a photo of the father and a family that I met almost a year ago. I'm actually working on a story about them now, but this is a family that I met in Tijuana last October, and I actually met them on the day they arrived in Tijuana after fleeing their home in southern Mexico. This picture is of a bullet wound, a gunshot wound on his back shoulder. And they told me the day that I met them that they were fleeing threats from organized crime groups in their hometown who basically, they said, believed that, the family had cooperated or given local police information about a homicide that happened. So anyways, they were facing clearly really imminent threats of danger in their home country. And so the entire family, all 19 of them, quickly packed up what they could and headed to Tijuana headed towards the US-Mexico border. They arrived in Tijuana and realized that they would not be able to just go to the border and ask for the protection that they said that they needed. So they've been waiting in Tijuana almost a year now. They've been at the shelter that I initially met them. They had an apartment at one point, and now they're back at that shelter, and they've just sort of been bouncing around the city, waiting for the day that their CBP-1 appointment comes, which again, this is the government app that would-be asylum seekers must use to enter the country right now. Yeah, they're trying to do it the legal way, right? They're trying to use the app to wait for their time to enter the country, but they're still facing pretty imminent threats, right? This man showed me messages that he received from someone who's threatening him, who found out that he's now in Tijuana, and yeah, so he feels that those threats that drove him from his home in southern Mexico are still very real and very present, and yet he's stuck in the same country that he's trying to flee from, that he's experiencing these threats. And now this family has spent almost a year in shelters. They spend birthdays there and the holidays, and they have young children with them, and it's certainly not a great place to raise kids. So I certainly think about them often. I think next picture, Will. Yeah, this is another migrant that I met almost a year ago. Her name is Lisbeth. She's from Venezuela. This picture is taken in her mobile home where she's been living. And she's like a lot of Venezuelans that I've met recently. She loves her home. She misses her friends and family, but due to the conditions there, right, an increasingly authoritarian regime and just crushing inflation, she felt like she had no choice but to leave her country for the US. So she's here. She's trying to get a job and make it work here. She had hopes that with the recent election in Venezuela that she might have the opportunity to return. But, with the way things went, it's still not possible for her. And I think this is, for me, sort of just a reminder that these events that are happening around the world, they might feel really far away, but they really do have impacts here in San Diego. There's a lot of people like Lisbeth who fled the country and are now trying to make it work in San Diego.
Thanks, Sophia. Shifting gears a little bit to more of your reporting, you've written a lot about deaths along the border, and uh, this has played a key role in your recent investigations and your ongoing work too. Where has that reporting taken you? What have you learned about deaths along our border?
Yeah. So one of the first projects that I worked on in this role was looking at environmental exposure deaths in Imperial County and also San Diego County. And these are deaths among people who cross into the US in gaps in the border wall, and they're crossing through the desert to try to reach, destinations across the US. And, many of them perish in this journey and in the extreme temperatures and environment in the desert. They have to hike for miles at a time or whatever. So we did a project mapping out those deaths and looking at where they were happening in Imperial and San Diego County. And I'm actually working on that again now, looking at deaths specifically in San Diego, very close to where I'm sure all of us, the various communities that all of us live in. And looking at why those deaths are rising again right now. So that's one type of death that we see happening on the border. There's also deaths that happen from border wall falls. So when former President Trump, he raised the border fence to 30 feet. And since this happened, there's been a really astonishing increase in injuries occurring from border wall falls when people who are trying to climb the fence to get into the US and then come down the other side. So there's been a few studies that have come out in the past few years looking at the increase in injuries from border wall falls that have been seen at local trauma centers. I think it's like something like 5 times the number of injuries that they have seen in these types of in trauma centers when the wall was pre-Trump versus after. So this project that I'm working on now, we're looking at the number of people that have died from this way, from falling from the border wall in the past few years. There was one story that I wrote recently actually about a woman who spent more than 20 minutes stuck on top of the border fence in San Diego. She was, screaming for help, during this time, waiting for fire rescue to come. And I spent probably hours watching this video dozens of times. And it was just, it's shocking sort of to see how helpless Border Patrol agents seemed during this time, despite the fact that these deaths and injuries from border wall falls have been going on for years now, right? Since at least 2020. And sort of just like the lack of coordination that's happening between Border Patrol and San Diego Fire Rescue and other authorities. And then also the death of, this was from a few years ago, but I also wrote about a man who died in CBP custody after he fell from the border wall. He didn't receive medical attention immediately, and he collapsed and ended up passing away that way. And that investigation actually led to a lawsuit that's still ongoing.
Thanks, Sophia. And I just want to add for everyone that the story that Sophia is talking about of the woman who was stuck on the top of the fence, the video that she's referencing was body-worn camera footage of Border Patrol agents who were there when she was up there and seemingly could not do anything. There was one somebody on the other side of the fence who mentioned a ladder, and the Border Patrol agent said, "No, we can't do that." So meanwhile, they're waiting for fire trucks to come by, and they're driving between the fences and then disappearing, and nobody knows where they are. And so it was just a really interesting and rare look behind the scenes of the emergency response at the border, which impacts San Diego because it's our agencies, our emergency rescue agencies that are being called out to respond to those incidents. So that's something ongoing that Sophia is digging into as well. Sophia, is there anything else you want to add about how you're investigating? You had a story that led to some of this emergency response coverage as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that story where you looked into the data on emergency calls?
Yeah, yeah. This was a story that we did a few months ago now. Again, at a time when many more people were crossing into the US. I talked about how many of them ended up waiting in the desert in Hakumba for days or for hours or days at a time. Well, that was also happening in the city of San Diego, but it was happening between the border walls. So the US-Mexico border in some places actually consists of two border barriers. And so we saw how dozens to hundreds of people, after crossing the southernmost border barrier, they were being held there by border authorities, again, waiting to be processed and documented by Border Patrol agents. But while they were there were a lot of medical emergencies that popped up among the people who were there. Again, these can be, pregnant women, pregnant people, sorry, and young children, otherwise medically vulnerable people. And so, yeah, we did a story looking at 911 calls to this area, how authorities were trying to navigate medical emergencies between the border walls, which is, clearly a difficult area to access. And we saw a lot of cases where it took quite a long time for fire rescue or other authorities to reach patients, and the process oftentimes was very confusing and sort of circuitous, and even after hundreds of 911 calls to this area over months, it still seemed that the coordination from Border Patrol and San Diego Fire Rescue was at times lacking, right? And people had sometimes really serious injuries, whether it was broken bones or heart conditions or things of that nature.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have a couple more questions, but we also have a question in the chat. So from Laura Wingard, who is an iNewsSource alum. Thank you for being here, Laura. Are your sources, from migrants to Border Patrol agents and others, talking much about our presidential election, and what are they saying?
Sure. Hi, Laura. Good to see you. Thanks for joining. And yeah, I was in Tijuana a few weeks ago talking with migrants at some shelters. This was before Vice President Harris announced she would be running for president. But at that time, there was a lot of anxiety among migrants and shelter directors about what was going to happen, about what a potential another Trump presidency would mean. As I mentioned before, right, a lot of these people have been waiting months to get into the US with the promise that if they wait, their CBP-1 appointment is going to come and they're going to get their chance. So I think a lot of people were scared that would somehow go away if Trump became president again. And certainly I think the director of those shelters were nervous about what that would mean, because anytime US policy changes, immigration policy changes in the US, it certainly has an effect on what's happening south of the border too. Border Patrol agents, I haven't had the opportunity to talk with many, but I don't think any of the Border Patrol, I don't think the Border Patrol Union is too excited about about a potential Harris presidency, but I'll have to ask around and get some more answers for you there.
Great, thanks, Sophia. And also, just a reminder to the audience, feel free to drop additional questions in the Q&A feature. Also, I mean, if you can't figure that out, I know Zoom can be sometimes nerve-wracking. So you can also use the webinar chat. We'll check both of those places. So go ahead and get those questions in if you have additional questions. Sophia, you and I have talked about just all of the sort of eye-opening things that you've learned while being an immigration reporter. Can you tell us what's the biggest misconception that you think most people have heard about the U.S.-Mexico border?
I think what I see missing from a lot of the conversations or debates about the border is just policies or ideas that go beyond the US-Mexico border, right? I mean, immigration does not start or end at the border. It goes much further than that. And the US can make as many policies as it wants, but without policies that really address the reasons why people are leaving their countries in the first place, I think they're going to be somewhat limited in how effective they are. Migration is a global issue. As I mentioned before, more and more people are on the move, right? As climate change is increasingly an impact, forcing people from their home. So just, political situations, right? People have been migrating across continents for centuries, and I don't think that's going to stop anytime soon. So yeah, I think addressing the sort of root causes of migration and talking about those factors beyond just what's happening at the borders is something that I see missing from conversation sometimes.
Right, thanks. Additional questions, looking for those questions if anyone has them. Sophia, curious, you have a lot on your plate. What are you working on next? Can you give the audience a preview of some of the things that you have coming up? Without giving away the scoop, of course.
Gosh, that's gonna be hard. Okay, well, I can say that I'm working on a project that I'm excited about, that I'm co-reporting with our education reporter. We're looking at, right, as we've mentioned so many times, last year was a record year for migration. And so we wanted to look at where families are ending up in San Diego, where new migrant students are ending up, in which school districts, and what kinds of challenges are they having, how are districts meeting these challenges, among others that they've already had, and yeah, how that sort of situation is playing out. So we'll have some stories on that soon. And also, like I mentioned before, we'll be doing some more reporting on border wall falls, where those are happening, and how US Border Patrol enforcement is also affecting where and when and how those types of deaths are happening.
Great. Thank you so much. I don't see any additional questions. We'll give everyone a couple seconds to jump in there. 1, 2. That's a couple. So yeah, Will, you wanna wrap us up?
Sure thing. Just wanted to also just kind of go through the rest of the photos because they are very lovely, and I think that's one of the things that we pride ourselves here at iNewsSource, is that we have a lot of beautiful media that are taken for all of our stories. And I think our immigration reporting definitely has a lot of those. And everyone can check those out too at our website at inewssource.org, and as well as the rest of Sophia's immigration reporting. Yeah, so without any other questions, it doesn't seem like there are any, but you can also, if you do think of questions, feel free to submit those to us at contact@inewssource.org, which is listed there, as well as Sophia's email there. Feel free to send us story tips or questions that interest you. And we just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and to all of our supporting members that sustain us and our reporting. Also want to note that after this webinar, there will be a survey that will pop up on your screen, just asking you for opinions on what you think our next topic should be for our next Dig This, which is again quarterly. With that, we just want to thank everybody and hope everybody has a very pleasant evening. And we look forward to seeing you all next time.